So I'm actually very delighted to be able to present the NATO 2030 Young Leaders Group today. And I appointed the group because I wanted them to help me, to assist me in making sure that NATO is fit for the future. So I'm very much looking forward to their ideas, their proposals, and I'm extremely grateful that they are all joining us today.
Well, I can see them up on the screen now, and I know you have many questions for them, so we're going to put a couple of them to them now. Would you like to ask your first question?
Yes, my first question is actually about climate change, because we know that climate change has security implications, and therefore we also need to address and discuss what is NATO's role in responding to climate change.
And I'm going to ask Katarina Kurtashova to answer this question.
Thank you, Secretary General, and I'm really happy that we are starting this discussion with a focus on climate change, which I consider to be one of the most profound challenges facing the alliance today. I think that politically, the 2 degrees debate should be as significant as the 2% debate we've been having. I think that NATO should dedicate more attention to climate-related security risks in its strategic communication strategy. Let's just imagine that we have a 2 degrees campaign that would be as widespread and as successful as the We Are NATO campaign has been. We have to remember that today member states' approaches to the relationship between climate change and security vary, and this has prevented the alliance from being able to reach a consensus on the matter. And it's not just the Trump's administration's climate U-turn, but it has also been the case in various Central and Eastern European countries. So I think that while the election of Joe Biden presents an opportunity to reinvigorate transatlantic cooperation on climate change, NATO also needs to get Central and Eastern European countries more engaged and to really lead by example and encourage all member states to advance emissions reductions and adaptation investment. And I think operationally, we can do more both on the prevention and on the response side. So just to give you one example, dealing with the root causes more effectively will require the alliance to increase organizational foresight, as well as to improve its analytical and risk and situational and threat assessment capabilities. And I think that also when it comes to the militaries in the field, we can go beyond their contribution to emissions reductions, because they can also seek to reduce their impact when it comes to water and food. And I think just to conclude, we have to remember that climate change is not just a transatlantic issue, it is a global issue, and that NATO needs to work alongside not just the EU, but also other security and military institutions, as well as agencies in the field. And I think that sharing of expertise and training for locally engaged personnel is crucial. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Katarina. And our next question, please, Secretary General.
So my next question is about terrorism. NATO has been at the forefront in the fight against terrorism for many years, but that fight continues. Just recently, we have seen terrorist attacks in France, in Austria, in Afghanistan, and also in other countries. So the question is, how can NATO further strengthen its role in the fight against terrorism?
And that question goes to Corey Fleischer from the United States.
Thank you for the question, Secretary General. As we all acknowledge, addressing terrorism is complex, and NATO has made considerable strides in the last few decades to advance its counterterrorism efforts, mostly through education, engagement, and capability development. I think these efforts will continue to be central to the alliance, but it offered 2 shifts in NATO's role with partners to fight terrorism in the future. The first, NATO should work with its partners to examine new means of employing existing military capabilities to build the legitimacy of security actors and strengthen their relationships among local populations. These efforts should focus on eroding support for terrorist activity while demonstrating the security sector's role in upholding human security. The second is to prioritize engagement with women and youth as critical stakeholders in preventing and countering terrorism. These groups are not monoliths or homogenous, and they possess diverse perspectives that are instrumental to building community-level resilience to terrorist activities. Women and youth are attuned to the local drivers of support for terrorist groups, and their deliberate and meaningful engagement is also necessary for strengthening the relationship between the security sector and civil society. So NATO has a key role to play here as the military alliance. These two shifts in NATO's role with its partners, I think, can build on NATO's previous counterterrorism efforts, but they will also allow the alliance to adapt to the evolving nature of terrorism in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Corey. Now, Secretary-General, this is so important to you that you haven't just kept your questions to yourself. You've also asked current NATO leaders, or leaders of NATO allies, to put their questions to the young leaders as well. And we're going to hear from a selection of them now, starting with German Chancellor Angela Merkel.
Sehr geehrter Herr Generalsekretär, sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, ich grüße Sie alle, die Sie an diesem NATO-Jugendgipfel teilnehmen. Und ich danke Ihnen, dass Sie sich mit Fragen zur transatlantischen und globalen Sicherheit auseinandersetzen. Und das in einer Zeit, in der uns durch die Coronavirus-Pandemie große Sorgen bereitet werden. Das ändert aber nichts daran, dass wir auch andere große Herausforderungen im Blick behalten müssen. Vor 30 Jahren wurde Deutschland wiedervereinigt. Kein eiserner Vorhang teilte mehr Europa und die Welt in Ost und West. Doch das Ende des Kalten Krieges bedeutete mitnichten das Ende von Bedrohungen. So manche Krise, gerade auch vor Europas Haustür, Terrorismus und hybride Kriegsführung, erfordern neue Antworten. Verschiedenste Entwicklungen, nicht zuletzt im Zuge des Klimawandels, können rasch sicherheitspolitisch relevant werden. Frieden, Freiheit und Stabilität zu bewahren und unsere Werte, auf denen unser Zusammenleben gründet, zu verteidigen, das ist und bleibt der Auftrag der NATO. Wie aber kann die Nordatlantische Allianz ihrem Auftrag unter geänderten und sich weiter ändernden Bedingungen gerecht werden? Wir wollen Antworten auf diese grundlegende Frage geben. Zum einen mit dem Reflexionsprozess mit Experten und zum anderen mit einer gesellschaftlichen Diskussion zur NATO 2030. Ich freue mich sehr, dass Sie sich in diese wichtige Debatte einbringen. Und ich bin schon sehr gespannt auf Ihre Vorstellungen und Anregungen dazu, wie wir die Akzeptanz der NATO, gerade auch bei jüngeren Menschen, stärken können und wie wir unsere Allianz auf die neuen Herausforderungen vorbereiten können. Viel Erfolg bei Ihren Beratungen und herzlichen Dank für Ihr Engagement.
And I'm going to ask Tanya Lacic to answer that question.
Thank you. I'd like to answer this question by telling you about this microscopic animal, which is rather obscure. I only learned about it by watching David Attenborough, of course. It's called the tardigrade, and it's quite a remarkable animal. Tardigrades are really one of the most resilient animals out there. They survived all 5 mass extinctions and are over 500 million years old. Now, I don't know if NATO will live to see its 1 millionth year old, but I do think the tardigrade can teach it some survival lessons. So how does the tardigrade survive all possible environments from radiation to outer space? Well, it not only adapts, it super adapts. Now, NATO also knows a thing or two about adaptation, but right now, NATO needs to adapt not only on one front, but on multiple fronts. For one, NATO needs to address new social demands from increased polarization to shifting priorities. NATO needs to also address invisible threats from pandemics to bots. And NATO also needs to fortify alliance cohesion at home. But maybe most importantly, NATO needs to get creative about how it uses its power. So NATO not only needs to become a creative super adapter, but I also think that NATO could use something called a damage suppressor. Now, ironically, this is not something that NATO officials came up with, but rather it's the unique protein that has kept the tardigrade alive all these years by basically keeping its DNA intact when facing all these threats. Now, NATO's DNA is made of its values and it's made of solidarity. So NATO, let's adapt, but let's make sure our DNA also stays intact. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya. And our next question comes from Justin Trudeau, Prime Minister of Canada.
Hi everyone, bonjour à tous et bienvenue au sommet de la jeunesse OTAN 2030. Je dis toujours que les jeunes ne sont pas seulement les leaders de demain, vous êtes déjà des leaders d'aujourd'hui. From the security implications of climate change to combating disinformation and now dealing with the threat of the COVID-19 pandemic, your voices, your opinions, and your leadership are more important than ever before. So thank you for getting involved and stepping up. Ensemble, on va bâtir un monde plus sûr, plus juste et plus inclusif pour aujourd'hui et pour demain. Now, today I want to discuss disinformation and the threat that it presents to democracies around the world. As you all know, the spread of disinformation has drastically increased in the past decade. Social media, while contributing a lot of good to our daily lives, has also increased the amount of false, misleading, and inflammatory disinformation that our citizens see every day, which has contributed to an erosion of trust in our democratic and international institutions. So my question to all of you is this: how can institutions like NATO and democratic countries help in the fight against disinformation so we can ensure countries can build back a better society for everyone?
And that question goes to Kevin Vuong.
Well, thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. As you know, NATO as a collective is a force to be reckoned with. We're 30 countries that will be home to nearly 1 billion people by 2035. And if NATO was a country today, we'd have the third largest population and the second largest economy, with a GDP per capita that's nearly 2.5 times the global average. So let's leverage our collective power for our collective defense against disinformation. There are NATO standard rounds that our militaries use, and we do that to maximize interoperability. So let's create a transnational standard that can guide companies, governments, and perhaps most importantly, the citizens of democratic countries to fight disinformation. In the absence of this, we leave it up to various companies, as we've seen on social media, to set their own. And these inconsistencies are vulnerability that can be exploited by our adversaries. So, Mr. Prime Minister, I hope that you and other leaders will stay tuned for the robust set of recommendations that my peers and I will prepare over the next couple of months for combating disinformation and how we can build back better together.
Thank you, Kevin. And our next questioner is Boris Johnson, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom.
Hello, everybody, and thank you to Jens Stoltenberg for inviting me to speak at this NATO Youth Summit, and to all of you for taking part. Today, you're going to hear about the amazing work that NATO does and how for more than 70 years, this alliance has acted as a giant shield of solidarity, protecting 1 billion people in Europe and North America. And yet, if NATO is going to guarantee our peace, liberty, and prosperity for the next 70 years, we must respond to emerging threats and challenges. One of the biggest is the way new technologies are transforming every aspect of our lives. So, there are 2 questions I want to put to you. How can the Alliance best use technology to help create a safer world? And what more can we do together to stop others from exploiting our own growing dependence on technology? Addressing those 2 questions will, I believe, help to ensure that NATO continues to keep us safe in the future. And I wish you every success with today's event.
And those 2 questions go to Jan Lukasiewicz.
Thank you for those questions, Mr. Johnson. So let me answer them. For the first questions, there are multiple areas where technology can help us create a safer world. Let's name a few. I think we should use the newest AI and big data technology tools to make data-driven, better, and swift decisions. Swiftness appeared to be very recently, during the COVID-19 crisis around the world, a crucial deciding element. Moreover, these tools can help us tackle ongoing information hybrid war. Secondly, we should focus on new domains such as cyberspace, the actual space, which provide us with opportunities to expand our knowledge, technology, scientific, and military advantage. Last but not least, I would put stronger emphasis on elementary and applied research and technology transfer. NATO membership states have a huge know-how and brain pool, which can brew brilliant and useful solutions we may need in future. To answer your second question, I think we should focus on education. It is a great paradox that the more we are dependent on technology, the less we understand it. As an alliance, we should change that. Technology shouldn't be a black box, which allow people to be manipulated and confused, especially in this disturbing world with chaotic information. NATO should help provide solutions and tools that would help us educate people to be independent, informed, and a lot harder to be manipulated.
And thank you very much, Jan. And Jens Stoltenberg, Secretary-General, is still with us in the studio. Jens, tell me, what is it that you've picked up on so far from the discussion that you find interesting?
As in one way, I think the most important message is that there are so many different issues NATO has to address at the same time, from technology, disinformation, collective defense, climate change, terrorism, and many other issues. And they are different, but they have one important thing in common, and that is that for NATO to succeed, we need to be able to change. So kind of permanent change, permanent adaptation is the key to NATO's success, and that's also the main purpose of NATO 2030 is to make sure that we are changing and that we're listening to young people as we are becoming fit for the future.
Thank you very much. We're now going to go to our next questioner, which is Mark Rutte, the Prime Minister of the Netherlands.
This year, my country celebrated 75 years of peace and freedom. Since the end of the Second World War, children have been able to grow up peacefully in the countries that make up the NATO alliance. Today, you might wonder, do we still need NATO? And the answer is, yes, we do. Because we cannot take our freedom for granted. It's true that since the end of the Cold War, freedom and democracy has spread further around the world. But the free and liberal societies of NATO's member countries and its many partners across the globe are not immune to outside threats. Today's dangers are different from those the world faced during the Second World War or the decades in which your parents grew up. Nowadays, we have to defend ourselves not only against guns and bombs, but also against new threats. Threats that are often invisible and can easily cross national borders. Your phone, your computer, your email, and your social media can all be hacked and used against you. To counter those threats, we need to work together. We need to work within NATO. But NATO also needs to work with other partners like the EU. And of course, we need to work with you, the younger generation. We need your technical expertise, your knowledge, and your networks. So let me be frank and ask you this. What can you do as someone with specific knowledge and skills to make sure we can live in freedom after 2030? I hope we can count on you. Thank you.
And that question goes to Gudde Jensen.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister. As the chair of the Committee on Human Rights and Humanitarian Aid in the German Bundestag, my experience taught me and continues to teach me every day that freedom needs to be defended both on a smaller and a larger scale. For the smaller scale, it is fighting for the release of one single prisoner. It is demanding justice for a killed journalist because of his or her work, or it is supporting in work and in action people who are fighting for the future of freedom in Belarus, in Hong Kong, or elsewhere. Because these small things, they matter. Every square inch we can take back of the shrinking space for civil society worldwide matters for the sake of freedom. And when it comes to the freedom in the digital age, we need to be aware that every single piece of legislation that is passed here with the rule of law in our countries, it may also serve as a blueprint for authoritarian regimes. This is a sphere where I can and will continue to work for freedom with a lot of my colleagues from across other parties. On a larger scale, and that is as important, we need a new emphasis and a new discussion about defending Western values, our values, the NATO alliance's values. We need to talk honestly about which countries may play a long game and strategically undermining our freedoms in the world. And we need ways to approach these challenges. Of course, there are questions that fall behind in day-to-day politics, especially during a pandemic. So this is what I'm already doing and will continue to do. Reminding my government in Germany, but also elsewhere, initiating discourse like this in the media and pressing for a position when it comes to dealing with global powers such as China or also NATO members such as Turkey. More than ever before, we are dependent on partners if we successfully want to conquer these crises. This is why we need to talk about how NATO not only as a defense alliance, but also as a multilateral institution, can help shape and conquer these crises and challenges. I'd like to take a little part in that endeavor as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Guido. And our next question comes from Estonia and President Kersti Kaljulaid.
Hello, future leaders of NATO. New technologies have already changed the face of conflicts and warfare. For example, we already see how the use of drones has shifted the balance not only in asymmetric conflicts, but now also in conventional warfare. But it doesn't stop here. Artificial intelligence may well undermine the technological edge of the West. What will we do if our adversary's AI turns out to be smarter than ours? In the past, it was usually the state and the military that drove technological innovation. Nowadays, innovation is shifting more and more to tech companies. We already see how some of our global competitors are effectively combining state and private sector resources in AI development. Hence, my question to you. What could NATO do so that the West won't end up as the biggest loser in this new technological race?
And that question goes to Andrea Garcia Rodriguez.
First of all, I would like to unmute myself and then thank Madam President of Estonia for the question. I believe that NATO should, first of all, anticipate the next technological revolutions. And I'm not only speaking about AI, which is something that is already having an impact in our lives and in our security, but also on the new emerging technologies such as quantum computing that is, if not now, will definitely disrupt our security environment soon. Second of all, I would like to respond saying that we need to strengthen our cooperation and we need to strengthen NATO in order to be able to face these new challenges arising, as Madam President of Estonia said before. And this is cooperation strengthened passes not only for like creating new defensive capabilities, but also pooling resources and certainly creating new offensive capabilities in certain domains, such as the cyber domain. We cannot guarantee defense if we do not build offensive capabilities as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrea. So, Secretary General, you're still with us as well. Could you, what are your thoughts on the technology race, and particularly artificial intelligence, and how it's going to change the landscape in the run-up to 2030? But what also you think NATO should be doing to get ahead of that technology race?
So I very much think that new disruptive technologies as artificial intelligence, but also many other technologies, they are now fundamentally changing the threats and the security challenges we all face. Actually, I believe that these technologies are changing the nature of warfare as much as the Industrial Revolution changed the nature of warfare a couple of centuries ago. And of course, NATO has always had the advantage of having a technological edge on all other potential adversaries or competitors, and we need to be able to make sure that we keep that technological edge when we now see such profound changes taking place. This is partly about investing, partly about one of the reasons why we need to invest more in our security, so we have the resources to develop new technologies and to keep this edge. But it's also very much about being able to work together, governments and private companies. And one of the big advantages we have in NATO is that we are 30 open, free societies with dynamic, competitive economies. And I think that's actually one of the best bases we have for being able to develop new technologies.
Thank you. And we're now going to go to Spain for our next question, and Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez.
In 2022, Spain will celebrate the 40th anniversary of its accession to the North Atlantic Alliance. This represented the first milestone of our new democracy, rejoining the international community and the starting point of an increasing responsibility in the international arena, always based on multilateralism and rules-based order. Much has happened in these 40 years, and the world has deeply changed. Globalization is the hallmark of our times, and we have always believed that NATO, that unites democracies that share common principles and values, must be a driving force of stability also in our neighborhood. That is why my country, Spain, has always strived for a sound partnership policy, for instance, with our Mediterranean partners. We believe that security is a two-way street, so that the more resilient our partners are, the better we can ensure security in our societies. Today, more than ever, we depend on each other. So I would like to know how we can deepen these association programs from a multilateral perspective in order to improve what we do and how we work together. Thank you.
And that question goes to Ulrich Troller-Schmed.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister, for the question, and thank you, Secretary-General, for inviting us to be here today. I think my answer for how we work abroad should start at home. Is NATO an institution or a community? If we merely see it as an institution, we will bury our values in administration. But if we see NATO as a community of democracies, we have opportunities for adaptation. It's time maybe to say what we stand for at home and band together with other democracies abroad. We're no longer bound by the Cold War in Europe. It's time to recommit to free institutions for the 21st century that we use it to bind us together as allies at home, and then stand in solidarity in the face of authoritarian challenges to free peoples abroad and to the challenges that they might have. So what can we do? Well, first of all, for the southern neighborhood, we can bring the African Union closer. Second, we can give the EU a seat at the table of the North Atlantic Council. Third, we can consider letting other democracies maybe even ally with NATO or join NATO, Japan, Australia, Mexico. It's bold ideas, but if we don't dare talk about innovation, we will avoid potential tension, but we will also risk losing our economic foundation, security, and values in the long term. Thank you.
Thank you, Ulrich. And our final head of state question comes from Zuzana Čaputová, the President of Slovakia.
I find it highly important to engage our young and bright, as one day it will be you setting the course and taking the decisions. One of the key topics we have been discussing in recent years is how to make our alliance politically stronger. Because to truly adapt to the dynamics of ever-changing world is not only about increasing military power. It is equally about investing in our unity and credibility. And this comes from the ability to act as one and swiftly, when needed, to protect our freedom, democracy, and the rule of law, to defend our peoples, and to maintain the trust of our citizens in our efforts. Thus, my question to you is this. In 2030, what will a truly politically strong alliance look like? What must we do today to make it happen? Thank you, and I wish you fruitful discussions.
And that question goes to Don Cedar.
Thank you so much, President. As the world's most powerful defense alliance, a politically strong alliance is crucial for the future and continuation of not only the NATO, but for ensuring a stable world. As we grasp this moment to reflect on where we see our alliance 10 years from now and how it will continue to keep us safe, I would like to contribute 3 quick points that we need to look to today to enhance the alliance. First of all, it will require a reassessment of the NATO's core values. Not only the times, but also the threats and the interests have shifted, and it is crucial to, while keeping the diplomatic ties intact, reassess why the NATO should be more relevant than ever and what it truly is that binds us. Shared values create trust, strength, a sense of belonging, and it is crucial that we re-examine openly and agree for the future on what basis the NATO countries should strive to move the alliance forward. Second of all, we need to raise awareness among the citizens of the NATO alliance countries. It is essential that we engage the community so that the alliance maintains, adapts, and grows a strong democratic support in all the alliance, in all the countries of the alliance. And third and lastly, to uphold its mission to strengthen the transatlantic cooperation, we need strong societies. We need to invest in each other, in democratic processes, but also in combating disinformation to make sure that we as individual NATO countries can be stable and therefore can provide for a stable and strong NATO. I truly believe that by sowing a seed today, we will be able to reap the harvest of a strong NATO in 2030. As the NATO young leaders, we will try to provide the NATO the next couple of weeks with some well-thought advice. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Don. Secretary General, just to wrap up in this discussion, what would a politically strengthened alliance look like in 2030? And what did you think of what Don had to say on that matter?
So first of all, I think that it's a bit early to conclude, because the whole purpose of NATO 2030, the work of the Young Leaders Group and the whole process is to actually get some proposals, some ideas, some input to help us shape and change NATO so we are fit for the future and that we are ready to also be a strong alliance in 2030. So this is a start of the process, a bit early to conclude the process. I'm looking forward to the proposals from, for instance, the Young Leaders Group. Having said that, I think there are some key issues that have to characterize NATO in 2030. One is that it has to be military strong because we face new and more challenging threats and evolving security challenges. And therefore, we need to invest both in military capabilities, but not least also to keep our technological edge. Then we need to strengthen NATO as a political alliance, and that's exactly about how we work with partners all over the world, in Europe, but also globally. And it is about how we address differences between NATO allies. There is no way to hide that sometimes NATO allies disagree, but then we need to be able to sit down and find solutions, ways to deal with our differences. And the third aspect, which I think is extremely important for NATO, is that we should remain a regional alliance, Europe and North America, but we need to have a more global approach, taking into account the fact that, for instance, the rise of China is changing the global balance of power. And that matters for NATO. And we see that China is coming closer to us, investing in our infrastructure. This is about resilience in the Arctic, in Africa, and of course in cyberspace. So we need to respond to the fact that more and more of the challenges we face are global, and therefore NATO needs a global approach.